Off. Okay, guys, can you hear me now? So UAE has attacked Iran. UAE has attacked Iran. In addition to that, we heard that there was a response. Sorry, and Iran has fired at US military vessels on the Strait of Hormuz. We're getting news right now. It's breaking news as and when we receive it. So make sure we're ready. We've got Marine Matthew coming on. He is a geopolitical expert and a military expert, and he'll be able to break down the perfect person because the last time we had him on, there was a huge amount of breaking news. Let's bring him on. Let's bring him on. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. How are you? Okay, I can't hear you. I don't know.
There we
if it's...
go.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay, there we are. I have muted myself. No, thank you for having me back on.
Matthew, what is it? Whenever you come, there's like huge breaking news. I had stuff that I wanted to speak to you about, and then immediately we've got this breaking news.
Excited. Hey, and I think the last time, not the last time, but the time before that I was on, this happened.
Yeah.
And same thing too. I came right from something else, so I didn't know what you were talking about. So now I've been frantically in the last minute or two trying to scroll through Twitter or X, and now, of course, it's not giving me latest news. It's telling me about what the New York Mets are going to do and other things.
Well, let me give you the update quickly. So, multiple explosions in Iran along the Strait of Hormuz area, various ports. Sirik was hit, Qeshm was hit, and one of the Bandar Abbas was hit. We weren't sure who did it. There were reports it was the UAE. There were other reports, and people do believe it's highly likely it's the UAE. Meher News is saying it's the UAE. Israel is saying they're not involved in this. And we have the United States of America not saying anything, although apparently they helped with the logistics in this attack. And then we just heard reports, just like literally minutes before you came on, that the Iran had fired towards US vessels on the Strait of Hormuz. So that's kind of the latest. Obviously, as news comes in, I am watching for it. We'll give you it and everyone as and when we receive it. But that's kind of the latest news on that. What's your thoughts? We never thought the UAE would strike. Although many people did. I had Larry Johnson on. He actually said that his source in the UAE had told him that the UAE was planning to attack on the 7th, which is today.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the UAE, if this is true, has done this. Certainly, their need to retaliate, as they would say, for the attacks against them earlier this week. But more, I think, importantly, the UAE trying to demonstrate that it is not the same as its fellow countries in the GCC. Certainly, the UAE sees this war, as many of us do, as a remaking of not just the Middle East order, but the world order. And, last week the news was about the UAE leaving OPEC, but certainly, too, the UAE acting militarily as it is. And I just actually did see a report that Egypt had sent a fighter squadron to the UAE. So the UAE trying to build its own foundation, its own role as a leader within the Middle East, right? Trying to be one of the major powers there. And of course, as everyone knows, they've got this hostility with Saudi Arabia. And I think the juxtaposition of the Saudis saying earlier this week to the Americans, you can't use our airspace, and the Emiratis saying today, you know what, the United States, we're going to do the attacking for you. I think that's a real juxtaposition where we see how America's alliance in the Middle East is starting to fall apart.
Just on that, Matthew.
Ways, right?
Just on that, Matthew, I don't want to interrupt you, but there is news on that as well, like literally about 45 minutes ago. So Saudi and Kuwait then gave permission for the US to use their airspace. This was like about 45 minutes ago to an hour ago. And the reports claim that the reason for that is because Saudi and Kuwait weren't happy that the US did not respond to the attack on the UAE. And and they're not happy that Trump is desperate for a deal. And so this is a way of leveraging it. Apparently Trump got on the phone with MBS, and then we see this attack like 30 minutes later. So just to give you a bit more context, more news,
Yeah. I mean, certainly. Now, in terms of how broad of an attack was, what they actually hit, will it actually matter? Will the Iranians respond? All that's to be seen. I did see something on my feed right before I started talking that the Iranians have said they've engaged American ships that were trying to take an Iranian tanker. That makes sense as well. That's been, I think, one of the fears that most folks have had about the United States trying to take these ships from the Iranians, is that you set up American forces to be essentially ambushed, that the American forces, when they're slowing down, when they're concentrating on a tanker or a cargo ship, they're more vulnerable than if they're out in the open ocean or open sea, as well as too, maybe the Iranians put that ship out there to bait the Americans in order to try and hit those American ships with drones or missiles or whatever. So, this is, if it's in relation to the Straits of Hormuz, the ships that the Americans seem to have had near the Straits in the last couple of days have been more called littoral combat ships. They're the smallest ships the United States has. They don't have much firepower. They're pretty thin, but they are pretty fast. Again, we'll have to wait and see what actually, has occurred here, because very easy to be taken by the fog of war in these situations, as as they say, not just in the military, but in hospitals, police departments, fire departments, anywhere where you're doing operations. First reports are often wrong.
True. And that's very important to say, because with the UAE, again, it's not verified. Mehr News have claimed it's the case, but no other agencies, and neither has the Iranians officially claimed it. The only thing that's possibly been claimed officially by Iran is this firing towards US vessels. But again, that could be because of just like firing shots, warning shots,
Right.
or something a bit more. But that's important. I'm glad you said that in the fog of war. Now, in terms of the US, and this is what I wanted to speak to you about, and this kind of links contextually, and obviously we'll give you the news as and when we receive it. But we've heard reports that Trump abandoned Project Freedom. What's your thoughts on him abandoning it and possibly thinking about restarting it now?
Well, it would make sense. That was my thoughts. I'm wondering about. It's so hard, this job that you and I are trying to do, what folks who are listening and watching are trying to do, to try and understand what's happening here. You have the fog of war, you have accidental misinformation and disinformation, you have deliberate disinformation out there, and that's all what's to come. But we also are dealing with, particularly with the American administration, men and women who are just abject liars, and a president of the United States who is, to put it polite, fickle, right? So we just don't simply know what the truth is so often, not just because of the reality of war, but because of the reality of the people who are making these decisions, putting forth these announcements, saying these things that we're trying to parse and interpret and understand. So, it would make sense then that, for me, this story about the Kuwaitis and the Saudis shutting down their airspace to the Americans as a result of the Americans not being respectful, because that's a story I saw. I saw a story about the Kuwaitis and Saudis were upset about the Americans essentially not being respectful. Now you're saying there's a story about this is because of the non-response to the UAE attack. I tend to believe the first story I heard, which jives with what essentially the Pakistani prime minister said in his post about this, that this was to force de-escalation, that they saw the Project Freedom as an escalatory move, that this was eventually going to lead back into a shooting war. Because how else is that, you're going to have these two forces, Iranian and Americans, coming into contact in the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman, and that eventually it was going to restart the war, that the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis have all had enough of this. And so that would be my interpretation of it. Now, Project Freedom, the way it was shut down so quick, it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, but it also shows a paucity, a vapidity, a superficiality within the Americans. This thing didn't even last as long as Joe Biden's peer in Gaza 2 years ago. Right? So you have this, for me as well, too, the way it played out with Donald Trump beginning of the week announcing Project Freedom, the Americans celebrating it, triumphal about it, it getting shut down within 36 hours, and then the Iranian response The Iranians putting out very, very deliberately and very clearly what the requirements are for ships to go through the Straits of Hormuz. So you had this American Project Freedom that falls apart in less than 2 days, and then the Iranians are basically saying, okay, now that that's done with, here's how it's going to work to transit through the Straits of Hormuz, demonstrating their control. You know what I mean? So, that's essentially what I think of Project Freedom. I think it was half-baked to begin with. It never had a chance, and it was ultimately always going to end this way. And thankfully, it was shut down before the war escalated back into a shooting war. And I think there's some thought out there that Project Freedom was just essentially to create circumstances, to create a situation where the United States would have a casus belli, right, to restart the war again. But, as long as this continues like it does, with this shooting going on every other day, shooting that we're unclear who's shooting at who, what's getting hit, etc., there will be that casus belli for the Americans to restart the war if Donald Trump feels that he wants to do. And one thing we should talk about is just how the American military does not want to restart this war, because they've made that clear through a number of leaks in the last couple of weeks that the American military is not in a position to win this war against Iran.
What? Oh, sorry. What about this attack that we've seen now? And again, we're just speaking in hypotheticals at the moment because we're not completely confirmed on what's happened. And then we'll speak about the second component of the breaking news. But if this is the UAE, if the UAE has indeed attacked Iran, has the UAE got the capability to defend against an actual onslaught by Iran?
Well, with the American help, they do. And as I said, I saw that message on X saying that the Sisi had sent a fighter squadron to the Emiratis. I think the British have a fighter squadron there as well. So there are multiple nations present in the Emiratis who can assist them, as well as, too, we know that relationship between Israel and the Emiratis, right? The fact that the Israelis sent the Iron Dome, one of their Iron Dome missile systems, to help defend the UAE. And the UAE, of course, after that was made public, said, basically the paraphrase, we could depend on the Israelis, we couldn't depend on the other Gulf states. I think that they can't, they cannot fight Iran on their own. But I think with the UAE, and then we've seen this through their warfare in Sudan, through their recognition of Somaliland, through Yemen, etc., the UAE wanting to be a regional power, right? And then that this way, working with the United States and Israel, proving itself to be reliable, proving itself to be willing to pull its weight, to do its part. It's creating conditions for if there is a dissolution of the American order, and by no means do I think the Americans are ever going to leave the Middle East, but certainly that there would be a triad, if you will, of the Emiratis, the Israelis, and the Americans forming a bloc within the Middle East. It seems maybe Egypt may be in there as well. But, certainly that would then counter this understanding of this growing Pakistan, Saudi, Turkish bloc, which, there might be something to that. There might not be. Who knows? We'll see. But, I think that's how I'm looking at this in terms of what are they trying to accomplish by doing this? And this, I think, is juxtaposed against what we see, again, in my estimation, from the Kuwaitis, from the Qataris, from the Saudis, of wanting this thing de-escalating, wanting the end of this, that they've witnessed their countries being used not just as military buffers by the United States, but by economic buffers. And so now, this commentary in the United States about just forcing Iran to collapse economically, it's essentially a game of chicken, an economic game of chicken between the Gulf states now and the Iranians. But the Gulf states are simply proxies, right? They're being used by the Americans in this game of chicken. Now, I would actually push back on that as well, too. I think that the American economy, the American public, the American political system is more vulnerable than the Iranian systems, and that Iran will be able to outlast economically the consequences of this war better than the Americans can. Again, whether it's the American economy, the American public, or the American political system. But I do see a lot of different pieces here where countries are either hedging or they're maneuvering for what would be, as we call the day after. But the other thing I want to say about if the reports about Iranian attacks are true, or Iranian responses or retaliation, or however it's defined, what that does is that really really pops the idea that the Americans and Israelis have of that if we can't get regime change in Iran, and if we can't knock them out militarily through the shock and awe campaign or whatever how they want to describe it, then the next thing we will do is we will mow the lawn, right? We'll mow the grass. People are familiar with that term of like you just keep going back and you keep bombing the Iranian missile sites, you keep bombing their drone factories, you keep bombing their, whatever, in order to try and keep the Iranians down. And what the Iranians are showing is that we're not Iraq. Right? You can't do this. If you think your plan is going to be similar to what the Americans did to Iraq from 1991 to 2003 of sanctions and blockades and pretty much weekly bombings, you've got it all wrong because we're not Iraq. And I think that's where there's a real serious miscalculation and misestimation by the Israelis and the Americans here. A lot of people say the Americans and Israelis don't have a plan B. I think they do have plan B. Plan B is what I just described. However, I don't know if they have a plan C. And that's why I tend to think more and more, we talked about this idea that this indefinite ceasefire, even with its intermittent periods of violence and dramatic episodes and whatnot, breaking news, will be what we likely will see, just an indefinite ceasefire, a frozen conflict, a modus vivendi that the Americans and the Iranians are able to agree upon without saying it out loud. The problem being is how will Israel handle that? And what will Iran, of course, do in regards to Lebanon?
Yeah, and I've got some questions already on the frozen conflict, but there is some more breaking news. It says, this is a source close to the Iranian government, says Iran initiated a military response to the maritime blockade. Military units of CENTCOM that are responsible for the attack on Iranian vessels will be targeted. Today, clashes have occurred due to this reason. So apparently there was clashes between US and Iranian vessels, but they're saying it's more about the kind of disagreement about the blockade and possibly the US stopping Iranian vessels. So just to clarify that one. You mentioned about frozen conflict. And obviously, guys, we are giving the news as and when we receive it. It is a little bit quieter now, but obviously once we receive it, we'll give the news. But, okay, and now, and by the way, Iranian state media is saying that there is no confirmation of airstrikes on Qeshm Island or any ports. Instead, military sources confirm that IAGC and the US Navy have clashed in the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran retaliating from earlier attacks on the Iranian cargo vessel by American forces. So again, everything's up in the air, but we obviously continue to give you the news as and when we receive it. And it says it has now been confirmed that exchanges of fire have been taking place between Iran and the US in the Strait of Hormuz. This is being reported by Israel Hayom, which is an Israeli source as well. So that's the latest news on that. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but if, in addition to that, the question is about frozen conflict. Like, in a tangible sense, how would a frozen conflict work though? What, US would just stay there? Like, how long can they stay there for? There is going to be a situation where someone's going to have to jump. Either the US retreats or Iran has to get kinetic because of or they allow it and the global market continues to capitulate. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of this idea, if it's a frozen conflict, the whole thing's a farce type of thing. The Americans continue to talk about their blockades. We heard Donald Trump yesterday say how the Iranian missile fleet's down to 18 or 19%. And then today, the Washington Post is saying, hey, the CIA tells us the Iranian missile fleet's at about 75% of what it was, right? So, I mean, Donald Trump can say whatever he wants to say. We expect him to say whatever he wants to say. His base will go along with that as long as attention can be diverted elsewhere. One of the things we've seen, Salim, in the last 7 months, we've seen the Americans go from Ukraine to Gaza to Lebanon to Greenland to Venezuela and now to Iran. The idea of them moving on to Cuba, they certainly can do that. They may not be always competent this administration, but they certainly are able to exert their will. Right. So the idea of moving on away from this, Donald Trump blames what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, the economic crisis, on the unwillingness of the Europeans to do their part. Right. I mean, we've already heard all the rhetoric already. Right. I mean, Donald Trump yesterday, again, in the Oval Office, turning to Pete Hegseth and saying like, yeah, we've basically knocked them back about 15 or 20 years. Right. So he could say that for the next year or two or three. And then the conditions that the idea being is that the Straits would reopen, the Iranians would be in control of it. The Americans could make comments about that. But essentially, there's now a $1 per barrel tax on oil. That's much better than, so now you're talking if oil eventually gets back down, say in 4, 5, 6 months to where it was before the war. So you're talking $65, $70 a barrel. You're talking $66 or $71 a barrel. Vice, what we've seen now, above 90, up to 120. And of course, the spot oil market being considerably higher than what we see with the futures, right? So we see, right now, I think Brent was about 95 or so before I came on. But what are they paying per barrel today? I think it's like probably 125, 130, 135, something like that.
Yeah.
So, right. I mean, the idea being of like, let's get away from that. And then the economic pressure, we're still going to get hit. But maybe at least by the American midterm elections in November, things have started to recede, right? And we're not getting hit with the worst of it. And again, the focus is going to be on Cuba. And then for the Iran, at the same time, too, the Americans keep up their blockade. There's certainly been plenty of American military adventures around the world that have been superficial. This could be another one, and the idea being that once a week, the Americans take a ship. They make a big deal about it, and CBS News talks about it or whatever. And I think the Iranians do put the pen to paper, and they do the math. And they say if we lose a ship once a week this way, it's not a big deal because we're getting 35, 40, 50 ships out for every one ship that the Americans take. Plus, we've got this toll. Plus, we've opened up new overland routes that are available to us now that weren't available, right? So we've got other ways of commerce. I mean, I don't think those routes are going to close that they're opening up, particularly through Pakistan once this war ends. I think that's a new corridor. I think, there is here, again, it's not the whole loaf. It's a half a loaf, but it's both sides being able to say to their constituencies, we won. All right. I mean, going back to the Republic and saying we won. And I think the Iranians certainly can say they have the Straits of Hormuz. They've essentially deterred the Americans and the Israelis. They've set about reordering the world. They are a world power now. If anyone wants to debate about whether Iran is a world power or not, please explain to me how they're not a world power, not just in the sense of they were able to, one, cause this political stress on America's allies, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world, but also, too, the economic warfare they are able to carry out, as well as being able to go toe-to-toe with the Americans. I mean, a lot of people frame this war, Suleiman, as being asymmetric. It is asymmetric in a lot of ways, especially 21st century versus 20th century. We could talk all about that. But on the other side, though, too, the Iranians did fight this and have fought this war symmetrically. And they have stood there and went, dished it out with the Americans and the Israelis. And according to what the Pentagon and the CIA are saying, as well as to, I think, what a lot of commentators who are objective have been saying for weeks now, if not for the months and years preceding this war, the Iranians have missile and drone dominance over the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, so you put all this together, and again, it makes sense for both parties to go along with this idea, or at least to continue with this indefinite ceasefire. The problem being, of course, is that good enough for the Israelis? And then, of course, if the Israelis don't withdraw from Lebanon, what do the Iranians do about that? I don't think the Iranians can make the sell that this has been a success if Israel has conquered southern Lebanon.
I totally agree with you, and I think that's going to add an extra dimension. Yeah. In addition to that, the other dimension is kind of what we're kind of alluding to today, which is the UAE. Would the UAE want to allow the United States of America to leave? And not just the UAE, the other Gulf states as well, but I think UAE has just been highlighted because we think they're behind the attacks today. But would they want the United States of America to leave and leave them in this kind of difficult spot where they've overtly quite clearly said that Iran is the enemy. I think Iran came out with a statement today and said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, but UAE for them is not considered a nation, but is considered an enemy hostile base. So,
Right.
like, where does that leave those places?
Well, and that certainly then means then if you look at the Iranian requirements to ship that goes through the Straits of Hormuz, UAE can't go through the Straits of Hormuz, right? I mean that means that the Emiratis are still trying to get their product, across the peninsula. But as we saw this week, that's vulnerable as well, right? I mean, so this idea, what the other Gulf states, you would think, looking at this logically, rationally, sensibly. Again, the other Gulf states would say, look, the Americans said that their bases were going to protect us. And those bases ended up being sponges for missiles and drones. The Americans are using us not just as their military buffer, but as their economic buffer. They expect to be able to, use us to wear out the Iranians before real harm or real hurt comes on to the United States. Just as the United States was going to use Europe as a buffer against the Soviet Union to fight World War III, right? And how nuclear doctrine for the Americans has been always predicated on the idea of that, well, the Russians or the Soviets will launch nuclear weapons against European states first, and by the time they consider hitting us, we'll de-escalated the war. It's the same imperial mindset of using these vassal states as buffers. So you would, as well as just, of course, the cost, right? The great cost that these countries are under. You would think that they would say, all right, let's figure something out different. But I don't know. I don't think so. I think these ruling families, these monarchs, they know a good thing when they've got one. And the United States has been what's kept them in power for decades.
Yeah.
And the risk of doing something different is too great. So even this all makes sense, and we could go in there and we could talk to them about this way, they would probably agree with us behind closed doors, but then they would say the risk is too great. The risk is too great. And then, yeah. So I think you see the Americans maintaining their presence there, and I think there's a very good chance that the Americans reopen these bases, because this is another issue of this whole 20th century versus 21st century thing. The Americans aren't going to give it up. This is the American way of warfare. We've already seen Central Command, the American Warfighting Command for the Middle East, say, hey, we need contract proposals. We need construction proposals to rebuild these bases. They've already put out RFPs, or requests for proposal, to rebuild the bases. So, this is the American way of war. This is the American century, the 20th century that's being defended here in this war by the United States. So the idea that the United States is going to give up these bases, or the United States is going to say, you know what, these $13 billion Ford-class aircraft carriers, they proved useless. We're not buying anymore. No, we're going to buy, we've bought 2 so far. We're going to buy 8 more at $13 billion, $14 billion a piece. There's no stopping that, even though they are a relic of the past, right? They are, essentially it didn't come, it's not as dramatic as this, but essentially what we're looking at here is cavalry charges against machine guns type of thing, in a sense of super carriers versus drones, right? And that's why this war is so important. Besides all the costs, the consequences, right? Those things.
I'm totally on board with you. I totally agree with you on a number of points you made. First of all, they've already said they're going to give $8 billion to the military industrial complex to buy more military equipment. In addition to that, I agree with you. I don't think the US is going to leave the Middle East. No. I'm completely on the same wavelength. One question I've got for you about that, though, is the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain was absolutely obliterated. It was decimated, and they had to move it to Florida. What's the kind of reasoning for moving it to Florida? What kind of tactical reasons are there? What kind of deficiency does it cause? And then will they need to move it back to the Middle East as per what you just mentioned earlier?
Well, it's untenable. I mean, the Fifth Fleet since the 1980s has been headquartered in Bahrain. It's interesting. The Americans
apologies. Just before you answer that, I'm so sorry I interrupted you.
No, please.
But we've got some breaking news as well. Air defense are active over Tehran as well. But sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the Americans really have no bases in the Middle East until the 1980s. They lease part of the base in Bahrain for a period of time, but certainly, up until Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, then Ronald Reagan, the American presence in the Middle East is really limited in a lot of ways to Israel and the Shah's Iran acting as the cops on the beat to contain Arabism, right? This is the Nixon doctrine. And then, of course, after the revolution in 1979 in Iran, the loss of that cop for the Americans, there is this move to put American military bases directly into the Middle East, and that begins in Bahrain, in Manama, with the Fifth Fleet being headquartered there, and then over time, particularly following Saddam Hussein in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the first Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War, 1990, 1991, you see a real establishment of American presence throughout the region, right? I mean, up until now, there is certainly no countries in the Middle East, with the exception of Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine. That's it, without an American military presence, in Iran, of course. The idea of the Americans giving up that footprint, even if they were to have this understanding that, hey, man, the 20th century is over, it's the 21st century, and you just had 16 of your bases demolished by I don't even think the drones cost $20,000, Suleiman. I think they probably cost like $5,000 or $6,000. By all these cheap drones.
Yeah.
Why don't you figure out something different? I don't think the Americans have the ability to do that. They have an imperial mindset. So not just is it this idea that the Americans are holding on to the last century, to what established their primacy, what gave them dominion. They also have an imperial mindset. You can never give up territory. You can never cede any portion of the empire. And so this idea of the Americans leaving these bases, for those reasons alone, leaving these countries for those reasons alone, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, and we've got a statement from Iran's armed forces, Mohammad Hossein Bagheri. He's the commander-in-chief of Iran's armed forces, and he just left a few words. He said, quote, "They will regret it." That was his entire statement. We don't know if he's talking about the UAE. We don't know if he's talking about the US. We don't know what he's talking about, but he said they'll regret it. So I am hearing there's a lot of air defense activity throughout Iran now. There's some in northwestern Tehran. There's in various areas of Tehran, I'm seeing a number of air defense activity. No explosions at the moment, so just to keep you aware, but that is kind of the latest news on that. But yeah, huge amount of air defense, even over Tehran as well. Now, Matthew, in terms of from this, I've asked this to a few people, but you're the perfect person to answer this. If this war was to become kinetic again, which it's really on the kind of ether where this may happen, the US has a number of vessels very close to the Strait of Hormuz. How much of a liability is that, or are they far enough out that there is not as much of a risk?
No, they're definitely within Iran's capabilities of hitting them, not just with their medium range, so there are missiles that can go up to 1,000, 1,500 kilometers, but also their shorter range missiles that may only be able to go a few hundred miles, as well as it's just the basics of this, right? The greater distance you have, the more time you have to react. And so the closer you're in, the less time you have to react. Also, too, the ability of the Iranians to find, locate and target the American ships when they're closer in, again, that's pretty evident, right? But so that's
We've just got some breaking news. I apologize. I'm interrupting you, Matthew.
No,
Matthew, you're
please.
used to this now. You're used to this
I
now.
like it.
I
I
do
mean,
apologize so much to you last time. I felt so bad, but I think you're in the groove. This is my show. You might not know much about my show, but my show is like a breaking news show. And then we add interviews on, but we're like breaking the news like 24/7.
Hey, man, if we've got this technology, if we can do this, why aren't we doing this?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, yeah, so this is great.
Exactly. We got Matthew Hoh giving us real time analysis on break. It is like almost like a football match. Unfortunately, it's war. We don't want that to be the case, but it is. So air defense interceptions over Tehran right now. This is happening. We've got the visuals of it. So this is definitely happening. They are saying it's drones. So there is drones basically attacking Iran, and then air defense is activated and they are intercepting these drones. So there does seem like there's activity actually. But sorry, go ahead.
And the UAE has the ability to put drones that far into Iran.
They do have
Chinese drones actually is what they've got, as well as other drones. But
they've got their own, their own drones as well, haven't they? There was one that I was reading that I forgot the name of it. It cost them like $40 million or something stupid like that. I could be saying the number wrong, but it cost them a huge amount of money. And maybe it's $4 million, but it cost them a lot.
So, I mean, you've got so much going on here, right? The
Yeah.
complexity of this is really astounding, and the ability of a nation like the UAE to prosecute a war like this, but knowing that it can only sustain that for a limited amount of time. And it certainly cannot sustain against Iranian retaliation like we saw in the first weeks of this war, where the number of Iranian missiles and drones fired at the UAE was in the thousands. They cannot do that without the support of the Americans, the Israelis. The Brits are there, as we just said. The Egyptians are there. I think the French are there as well. The Australians have people in UAE. I can't remember what they're actually doing, but they do have people there. Yeah, I mean, the proximity of, to get back to this idea about proximity of the American ships, obviously was something the Americans were incredibly concerned about, because the American ships were hundreds of kilometers from the Iranian coastline all through the 5 weeks of the war. The aircraft carriers were even farther back. The aircraft carriers so far back at 1,000 kilometers, I don't think their aircraft were able to be employed, because an F-18 can only go about 400 or 500 kilometers, I believe, when it's got a full load of fuel and weapons. Essentially you're looking at super carriers that were useless. Now certainly they can be refueled in the air and everything, but now you're talking about crew exhaustion, you're talking about length of time of the mission, you talk about, all kinds of different things. But, but this idea of maybe now the Iranians are going to force the American ships back is something that would be seen operationally as Iranian control of the battle space. And, for everything the Americans say about this, unless they can figure out a way to take out the Iranian drones and missiles, which I don't know how you would do that. That's impossible. You're going to invade Iran with a 2 million man army. I mean, it's 4 times the size of California. It's 4 times the size of Iraq. And so we had the United States, Britain, and others had well over 200,000 troops in Iraq, and we never controlled any of it. What would you need to find every missile and drone launch facility, launch pad, production facility, etc.? You're talking millions and millions of people to occupy. So this whole thing, is so insane, because there's no resolution to it militarily for the U.S. And this game that we're going to see now being played out, the American ships getting close and then having to go back out again, I think that's what we could be seeing now for, weeks or months to come.
Okay, on the break, we got some more breaking news. By the way, there's a lot of air activity, a lot of drones, a lot of firing on drones. I'm hearing they're micro drones, and I want you to explain what that is as well for us. IDF, and so they're saying it could also be happening internally from possibly Mossad agents. We just don't know where it's coming from. But also the IDF radio reports Iran fired at 2 U.S. Navy destroyers as they were exiting the Strait of Hormuz. So that's the other piece of news. Lots of news coming out. But in terms of micro drones, what are they, if you can explain to the audience?
Well, micro drones are just small drones. Micro drones are I think that's a fairly generic term. I think micro drones actually mean the small handheld ones.
Right.
And so I'm not sure how that report is using that term. But regardless, you're talking about smaller drones that don't launch from an airbase 400 kilometers away, right, and fly a 12-hour mission, and that essentially are as big as an airplane. These are drones that you see people in your community using, right? I mean, the idea being that they can be smuggled into Iran and then launched by operatives, throughout the country. We've seen Ukraine do this against Russia, and we've also seen the Americans and the Israelis do this against Iran. Certainly, we've seen the number of drone attacks over the last couple years within Iran carried out by American or Israeli operatives or proxies or whoever. It's clear that this is part of the American-Israeli playbook. So naturally, you would assume that in a lull like this, the ceasefire is more than 4 weeks now. April 7th, I think it started, right? So in the month that we've had this ceasefire for, the Americans and the Israelis would have been repositioning, they would have been resupplying, they would have been setting up their cadres within the country to carry out these types of attacks. If we see it, if that's what it is, and those types of attacks are very effective for assassinations, of course, but they're very effective too at causing general panic and confusion. I mean, they can't do a heck of a lot of damage. And a lot of times the damage they do is superficial, is repaired rather quickly. They can't destroy hard targets. They're not going to kill somebody who's in a bunker, but they can certainly cause a lot of panic and confusion and terror. And as we saw, if you have exposed hardware, like American radar systems sitting underneath the open sky, a drone, you don't even need a Shahid drone. You could have used, a handheld drone to destroy that radar system because it was so vulnerable.
We've got some more breaking news. Quite a bit has come out. An informed Iranian official says Iranian missile struck a U.S. Navy vessel as it was exiting the Strait of Hormuz. The claim is that the vessel sustained damage and was forced to flee. Also, it's been reported by Fox News and a few others that the U.S. are the ones who struck Iran's Qeshm port and Bandar Abbas. So it was the United States of America who struck Qeshm port and Bandar Abbas. So it does sound like the war's restarted, although the U.S. official said, we did hit it, but the war hasn't restarted. So I don't know how that works, but that's the latest news that we're getting.
And this is kind of, I think, the nightmare scenario for a lot of us. This sounds, if that's the case, if the United States hit the port facilities, what you're seeing is Donald Trump listening to Fox News. This is Donald Trump listening to Mark Levin and Hugh Hewitt and Jesse Waters and Brett Baer and the other cast of characters, telling him that this is what he needs to do. This is him following the advice of retired General Jack Keane. This idea, we just need to drop, one more week of dropping bombs and the Iranians will capitulate, right? I mean, this idea of just have to drop X amount more bombs and we'll get the results we're looking for from these warmongering lunatics, essentially. And that's the nightmare scenario I think a lot of us has had, that Donald Trump is going to listen to Fox News. He is going to listen to Jack Keane. He is going to listen to Mark Levin, and this war is not going to end. And one of the things we saw, and forgive me if I've already said this to you, but in the last 2 weeks, we saw leaks coming out of the Pentagon and the CIA into the New York Times, into CNN, into NBC News, and now today into the Washington Post. And, the first leaks to the New York Times was about the level of missile and drone stocks that the Iranians possessed, that the Iranians essentially had enough drones to carry out missile attacks at the rate they were under, at the rate they launched them during the war for months to come. And essentially, they have enough drones and ability to produce drones to carry out drone attacks, again, at the same level, 100 to 120 drone attacks a day, indefinitely. And then that leak was followed by a leak to CNN that said that, American missile systems are running low, that we've used up half of our Patriots, half of our THAADs, half of our JASSMs, right? And so certainly right there, you're seeing the Pentagon, through two of its most trusted media partners, the New York Times and CNN, that we are on the losing end of this missile and drone battle, that Iran has missile and drone dominance. And then you see that big NBC News story a week ago detailing the expanse of the damage and destruction on American bases throughout the region. And then today you have this Washington Post story saying, hey, the CIA is saying that the Iranians are going to be able to last for months before they really start to feel the consequences of this war economically. Yeah, it's going to hurt them, but they're in a position to withstand, and that's juxtaposed, of course, against better. They can withstand better than the Gulf states can. And as well, too, this wasn't said, but they can certainly juxtapose better than the Americans can. That certainly the consequences to the United States economically, the United States cannot weather that the way that the Iranians are going to be able to weather this economic warfare. So those are four big leaks to the four biggest media outlets in the United States, essentially, by the Pentagon and the CIA in a coordinated and deliberate manner. And so what are they doing there? They're essentially saying, we can't win this war. That the United States military is on the losing side of this war. And if we restart this war, at best, we're going to have a status quo, but more than likely, we're going to lose. And I can't tell you something if that's ever happened before. If the Pentagon and CIA have coordinated in large multiple leaks in a compressed time period to not saying they don't want to fight this war again in opposition to their political bosses, right? I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. So this is really important. This is really pretty startling that the Pentagon and CIA are saying so clearly out loud, we can't win this war. Don't restart this war. But Donald Trump is going to listen to his friends on Fox News. And besides, this information from the CIA and the Pentagon, it's not making it to Donald Trump. When Donald Trump said the other day to Pete Hegseth, the Iranians are down to 18 or 19% of their missiles, I think he genuinely believes that. That's what he's been told. And he doesn't know that his people at the Pentagon and CIA say, no, their missile fleet is about 70 or 75% of what it was. And their drones, this is my interpretation of it or analysis of it. The Iranian drone capacity is indefinite. If the Iranians just want to do what they did for the 5 weeks of this war, 100 to 120 drones a day, they can do that. They can do that indefinitely. They can produce 100 to 200 drones a day, no problem. It is remarkable that you have the American military and intelligence services, again, saying quite out loud, don't start this war again. But from what we're hearing, maybe they have.
Yeah, it does sound like they possibly have. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Apologies once again for such a frantic episode. I was looking down so much. But thank you so much for taking your time out to join us. Where can people find your work?
So I'm on X, Matthew Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H, and also on Substack too, Matthew Hoh. The blog's called Matt's Thoughts on War and Peace, but just, Matthew Hoh on Substack. So, hey, I appreciate you having me here.
Appreciate everyone. Give Matthew a follow. Follow him on X. We've got a huge audience on X. Everybody follow him on X, and everybody also follow him on Substack. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you coming on, Matthew.
All right, thank you. Have a good rest of your night.
Appreciate you too as well. That was Matthew. He's a Marine. Make sure you give him a follow. He is great. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you comment in this video. Give me your thoughts. Subscribe. Put your notifications on. Listen, we've got such huge interviews lined up tomorrow. You'll be shocked. We got Larry Johnson. We got Trita Parsi. We got Ian Proud. And we've got now one of the most viral people that is Professor Robert Pape coming on tomorrow. It's going to be huge. So make sure on this channel, Moral Resistance, you have your notifications on, have the bell on. We got huge episodes coming tomorrow. Coming back to this, let me know in the comments, what's your thoughts? Is it the US attacking? Is it the UAE attacking? What is going on? Is this the start of the war? Let me know your thoughts in the comment. Iran can't allow the attacks on their nation to happen without any major response. Let me know your views, your thoughts, and your ideas in the comments. We are going to be moving back to the other channel. So I know it's going to be a bit of a flip-flop today, and I apologize for that. Normally I don't do it like this, obviously, but a lot of these things were like randomly organized based on the difficulty of what I was having in terms of organizing it. But tomorrow we'll be back to normal where we only swap once. There is going to be a bit of flip-flop today, but normally the one. But I'm going to put that in the comments of the YouTube section, and everyone come across to the other channel. And I think that debate is still happening, although I don't know whether I should do it or not, because this is huge news. So let me know your thoughts on that. Shall I continue with it? There's renewed air defenses in Western Tehran right now. So once again, renewed air defense activated in Western Tehran right now. So that's happening. Oh, nice one. Beatrix has done it. I won't say she's faster than me. I'd say she accidentally slipped and pressed it. But yeah, follow what she just said. Move to that channel. I'm going to be ending the stream here. We're moving across. X is obviously continuing.